Blood dripped from Gabriel's knuckles as he stared at the trembling, plus-sized woman weeping on his Persian rug. She wasn't supposed to be here, but when she finally choked out the words, "My father," and "my brother did that," the city's most ruthless kingpin didn't reach for his gun. He reached for his phone to order a massacre. Clara Davies had spent her entire 26 years trying to shrink a cruel irony for a woman whose body naturally commanded space. She was fat a word her father Richard and her older brother Jonathan wielded like a serrated blade whenever they needed to carve away her self-esteem. They had convinced her long ago that her weight made her unlovable a burden to the family and a grotesque stain on the polished image of Davies' logistics. Because of this, Clara was kept hidden. She was the ghost in the machine working 60-hour weeks in the damp, windowless basement office of their Chicago warehouse, balancing ledgers, managing payroll, and desperately trying to keep the family business afloat, while Richard and Jonathan squandered their profits on high-stakes poker and luxury cars. Clara accepted her lot. She believed the poisonous lie that, because she didn't fit the world's narrow standard of beauty, she owed her family her relentless, invisible labor just to justify her existence. But loyalty, Clara was about to learn, was a one-way street in the Davies family. It happened on a torrential Tuesday night in November. Clara was hunched over a glowing monitor, her thick thighs pressing against the cold metal of her desk, frantically trying to find a missing $2 million in the quarterly accounts. The numbers weren't just wrong. They had been deliberately scrubbed. Panic fluttered in her chest, tight and suffocating. Before she could pick up the phone to call her father, the heavy steel door of the basement office groaned open. Footsteps echoed down the concrete stairs. Not just two pairs, but several. Heavy, deliberate, and ominous. Richard and Jonathan descended first, their faces pale clothes, soaked from the rain. But it was the men behind them that made Clara's blood run cold. 3 men in immaculate, dark-tailored suits, moving with the terrifying, silent grace of apex predators. At the center was Gabriel Marino. Gabriel was a phantom in the criminal underworld, the head of the Marino Syndicate. He was brutally handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features, jet-black hair, and eyes the color of a frozen lake. His reputation was etched in blood across the eastern seaboard, a man who didn't just destroy his enemies, but erased their entire bloodlines. Richard. Gabriel's voice was a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate the very walls of the basement. "You said you had my collateral. This is a basement full of dust and cheap electronics." Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He refused to look at Clara. Instead, he pointed a trembling finger directly at her. "There, that's her. That's the collateral." Clara froze, her hands hovering over her keyboard. "Dad, what? What is going on?" Jonathan stepped forward, a cruel, mocking sneer twisting his lips. He looked at Gabriel, then back at his sister, his eyes dripping with disgust. "She's the sole owner of the offshore holding accounts, Mr. Marino. We set them up in her name. If you want your money back, she's the only one who can authorize the transfer. Take her. Keep her until it clears. Honestly, take the pig. She's got enough meat on her bones to survive a few winters in your cellar." The sheer brutality of the words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Her breath hitched, tears instantly pooling in her eyes. She looked at her father, begging silently for him to contradict Jonathan, to tell them it was a sick joke. Richard finally met her gaze, his eyes dead and cowardly. "I'm sorry, Clara. We had no choice. You owe us for putting a roof over your head all these years." Gabriel Marino didn't blink. His cold eyes swept over Clara. He saw her plus-sized frame, her worn, oversized cardigan, the terrified trembling of her bottom lip. He was accustomed to collateral beautiful mistresses, arrogant sons, prized racehorses. He had never been handed a terrified broken woman who looked as though her own family had already shattered her soul into 1,000 pieces. "Take her!" Gabriel commanded his men quietly. When the two enforcers stepped forward, Clara didn't fight. The betrayal was so absolute, so profoundly deep that it paralyzed her. As cold steel handcuffs were locked around her thick wrists, biting into her skin, she realized the horrifying truth. Her family hadn't just used her as collateral. They had thrown her to the wolves, hoping she would be devoured so they could escape. As she was dragged up the stairs, Jonathan's laugh echoed in the stairwell. "Don't feed her too much, Marino. She'll eat you out of house and home." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, letting the darkness take over as the cold rain of the Chicago night washed over her face, her father's cowardly silence ringing louder than the thunder. The Marino estate was a sprawling Gothic fortress nestled in the isolated hills outside the city. Clara was not thrown into a damp dungeon as her brother had cruelly predicted. Instead, she was placed in a sterile, high-security guest room. It had no windows, only smooth grey walls, a heavy mahogany desk and a simple bed. For 2 days, Clara sat in the corner of the room, her arms wrapped around her knees, refusing to eat the meals brought to her by silent guards. The silence was deafening, leaving her alone with the agonizing realization of her reality. She was a hostage of the Mafia, but worse, she was a discarded piece of trash to the only people she had ever loved. The psychological torment of her weight, the years of being called a worthless fat burden, culminated in this room. She truly believed her life was over. On the evening of the 3rd day, the heavy door unlatched with a loud clack. Gabriel Marino walked in. He had removed his suit jacket, wearing only a black dress shirt, with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and dark, intricate tattoos. He pulled out the chair from the desk and sat backward on it, crossing his arms over the backrest. He stared at her for a long, calculating minute. Clara pressed herself harder into the corner, pulling her oversized sweater down over her knees, trying desperately to hide her body to become invisible. $2 million, Clara. Gabriel started his voice, a low, dangerous rumble. That is what your father and brother stole from my shipments. They told me you are the sole signatory on the Panamanian accounts where the money is stashed. Give me the authorization codes, and I will put you on a bus anywhere in the country. Refuse and things become unpleasant. Clara's voice was a ragged, broken whisper, rough from days of disuse and crying. I don't know what you're talking about. Gabriel's eyes narrowed. Do not play stupid with me. I am not a patient man. I'm not playing stupid. Clara suddenly sobbed, the dam finally breaking. She looked up at him, her face red and tear-stained. I'm the accountant for the legitimate freight. I balance the books for the local deliveries. I don't know anything about Panamanian accounts. I don't know anything about your shipments. Gabriel stood up slowly, kicking the chair aside. He walked toward her, crouching down so he was eye level with her on the floor. His physical presence was suffocating, terrifying. Your brother said you set up the accounts. He showed me the digital signatures. They match yours. They forged them. Clara cried out, her chest heaving. The sheer injustice of it all ripped through her fear, replacing it with a hysterical, desperate anger. They forged my signature. Don't you see what they did? They stole your money, and they pinned it on me. Gabriel stared at her, unblinking. Clara dragged a trembling hand through her tangled hair. They've hated me my entire life. They hid me in the basement because I was too fat to be seen by the clients. They verbally abused me every single day, telling me I was worthless, that no one would ever want me, that I was just a disgusting pig. She choked on a sob, the traumatic words burning her throat as she said them out loud to this terrifying stranger. When they realized you were going to kill them for the missing money, they set me up. If you kill me, the trail goes cold. You'll think the money died with me, and they get to walk away free." She squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the blow, preparing for the Mafia boss to call her a liar, to strike her to end it all right there. "My father and my brother did that," she whispered, her voice breaking into a million jagged pieces. "They didn't give me to you as collateral, Mr. Marino. They gave me to you to be the scapegoat. So just do it. Just kill me. I have nothing left anyway." Silence stretched in the room. It was heavy, thick, and suffocating. Clara waited for the bullet. She waited for the cold hands of a killer. Instead, she felt a sudden strange warmth. She opened her eyes and gasped. Gabriel Marino, the ruthless, cold-blooded executioner of the underworld, was reaching out. His large, calloused hand gently brushed a tear from her cheek. His touch was shockingly tender, a stark contrast to the violence that usually lived in his hands. Gabriel's jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle ticked violently in his cheek. The cold, icy detachment in his blue eyes had shattered, replaced by a dark, terrifying inferno of pure rage. But the rage wasn't directed at her. He looked at Clara, at her plus-sized frame, hunched in defensive terror, at the deep, agonizing wounds of familial betrayal carved into her expression, and something fundamental inside the Mafia boss snapped. Gabriel knew betrayal. He lived in a world built on lies and deceit. But the profound, sickening cruelty of a father and brother, mentally torturing their own flesh and blood, tearing down a woman because of her weight, and then offering her up to a monster just to save their own cowardly skins. It disgusted him on a visceral level. He looked at Clara's trembling lips, her deep brown eyes wide with shock at his gentle touch. She was beautiful, he realized suddenly. Beneath the oversized defensive clothing and the crushing weight of her family's abuse, there was a raw, resilient beauty that Richard and Jonathan were too blind and arrogant to see. Gabriel slowly stood up, his eyes never leaving hers. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Mr. Marino!" Clara whispered, terrified by the sudden shift in the room's energy. Gabriel pressed a button on his phone, holding it to his ear. When his lieutenant answered, Gabriel's voice was the sound of a guillotine blade dropping. "Find Richard and Jonathan Davies." Gabriel commanded, his eyes locked onto Clara's, promising a terrifying, unholy retribution. "Drag them out of whatever hole they are hiding in. Do not kill them. I want them brought to the warehouse. They are going to learn what happens when you throw your own blood to the wolves." He hung up the phone and looked back down at Clara, extending a hand toward her. "You are no longer a hostage." "Clara," Gabriel said softly, the lethal promise in his voice sending shivers down her spine. "You are going to be my queen. And tonight, you are going to watch your family burn." Clara had never known what it felt like to be seen, truly undeniably seen, until the next evening. For her entire life, her body had been a cage constructed by the cruel words of Richard and Jonathan Davies. But Gabriel Marino treated her as if she were a Renaissance masterpiece. Hours before they were scheduled to leave for the warehouse, a team of high-end, discreet tailors arrived at her suite. They didn't sneer at her measurements or offer backhanded compliments. Instead, they draped her in a custom, deep crimson silk dress that wrapped perfectly around her waist and cascaded over her thick thighs. For the first time, Clara looked in the floor-to-length mirror and didn't see a fat, worthless burden. She saw a statuesque, imposing woman. She saw power. Gabriel waited at the bottom of the grand staircase. When he looked up and saw Clara descending, his breath visibly hitched. He didn't offer a polite, empty compliment. He simply walked to the foot of the stairs, took her hand, and kissed her knuckles. "They tried to bury a diamond in the dirt," he murmured, his blue eyes flashing with a possessive dark pride. "Tonight we show them exactly what you are worth. The ride to the Marino Syndicate's private shipping docks was executed in heavy, tense silence. Rain lashed against the tinted windows of the armored SUV, mirroring the storm brewing in Clara's chest. She was terrified, yet beneath the fear, a dormant, white-hot ember of vengeance had finally sparked to life. When the heavy steel doors of the warehouse rolled open, the smell of brine, rust, and damp concrete filled the air. At the center of the cavernous room, illuminated by harsh industrial floodlights, sat Richard and Jonathan. They were bound to steel chairs, their expensive tailored suits torn and stained with grease and blood. 3 of Gabriel's heavily armed enforcers stood in the shadows, silent as statues. As Gabriel and Clara stepped into the circle of light, Richard's head snapped up. His eyes widened in absolute shock. He expected Gabriel. He did not expect Clara radiating a fierce, untouchable dignity in her crimson dress, standing shoulder to shoulder with the most feared man in the city. Clara. Richard gasped, his voice raspy and broken. Jonathan scoffed, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the concrete, his arrogance refusing to die even in the face of death. Look at you dressing up the pig merino. What is this? You think putting lipstick on her changes the fact that she's a pathetic... Gabriel didn't yell. He didn't even blink. He simply flicked his wrist. An enforcer stepped forward from the shadows and drove a heavy combat boot directly into Jonathan's knee. The sickening crack of bone echoed through the warehouse, instantly followed by Jonathan's agonizing, piercing scream. "Every time you insult her," Gabriel said, his voice a low, terrifying hum that carried effortlessly over Jonathan's wails, "you lose a piece of yourself. I suggest you choose your next words with absolute precision." Richard began to hyperventilate, pulling desperately against the thick zip ties biting into his wrists. "Mr. Marino, please. We can get you the money, I swear to God. Just let us go. We gave you the girl. We gave you the collateral." "You gave me a scapegoat," Gabriel corrected, stepping closer. He pulled a thick manila folder from his coat and tossed it onto the concrete at Richard's feet. "Did you really think my people wouldn't look into the offshore accounts? Did you think I was just a brute with a gun?" Clara stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment. "I balanced the books for Davies Logistics for 8 years, Dad," she said, her voice shaking at first, but growing steadier with every syllable. "You thought I was just blindly crunching numbers in that basement. You thought I was too stupid, too broken to see what you were doing." Richard stared at her genuine panic, finally breaking through his cowardly facade. "I saw the phantom shipments," Clara continued, her eyes narrowing. "I saw the diesel fuel overages. I knew you were skimming. But what I realized in Mr. Marino's guest room was where it was going. You didn't just steal the 2 million. You sold out Mr. Marino's smuggling routes to the O'Bannon syndicate. You took a payout from Liam O'Bannon to sabotage Marino shipments, and you framed me so Gabriel would kill me and the trail would end." Gabriel looked at Clara, a smirk of deep, profound respect touching his lips. She had figured it out entirely on her own, using only her eidetic memory of the company ledgers, confirming exactly what his hackers had discovered an hour prior. "You lying bitch!" Jonathan shrieked through his tears, clutching his shattered knee. "She's lying. She's trying to save her own fat ass." Gabriel stepped forward, unholstering the heavy silver pistol from his waistband. He pressed the barrel directly against Jonathan's forehead. The younger man instantly froze, sobbing a dark stain spreading across the front of his torn trousers. "I don't kill liars, Jonathan," Gabriel whispered. "I killed traitors, and you sold me to the Irish. Please!" Richard screamed, thrashing in his chair. "Take the company. Take Davies Logistics. Take the houses, the cars, everything. Just let us live." Gabriel slowly lowered the gun, a cold, calculating smile spreading across his face. "Death is too easy for men like you. You fear poverty. You fear irrelevance. You fear being looked down upon more than you fear the grave. Gabriel gestured to his enforcer, who stepped forward with a sleek tablet and a biometric scanner. You are going to sign over every single share, every asset, every property of Davies Logistics. But not to me. Gabriel turned to look at Clara. You are signing it all over to Clara. Richard's face drained of all color. No. No, she doesn't know how to run a company. She's just a brilliant forensic accountant who kept your miserable failing empire afloat while you gambled it away. Gabriel interrupted sharply. Sign. Trembling, broken and weeping, Richard and Jonathan pressed their thumbs to the scanner, legally transferring their entire lives to the woman they had tormented for 2 decades. Now, Gabriel said, pocketing the tablet. My hackers have forwarded all the evidence of your embezzlement, not just my money, but the millions you stole from your legitimate clients to the FBI. The feds are waiting outside your penthouse right now. You are going to spend the next 30 years in a federal penitentiary, and every day you sit in a concrete cell, I want you to remember that the daughter you called worthless owns your empire, and she is untouchable. Gabriel turned his back on them. He offered his arm to Clara. She looked down at her father and brother, broken, sobbing, and pathetic. The massive weight she had carried on her shoulders her entire life suddenly vanished. They had absolutely no power over her anymore. She took Gabriel's arm, holding her head high, as they walked out of the warehouse, leaving the Davies men to rot in the ruins of their own arrogance. 6 months later, the criminal landscape of the city had completely transformed, and so had Clara. She was no longer Clara Davies, the ghost of the basement. She was Clara Marino. Their wedding had been a private, heavily guarded affair in Tuscany, far from the blood and concrete of Chicago. Gabriel had proven to be exactly what he promised, a man who worshipped her mind, her resilience, and her body. He banished the ghosts of her past with a fierce, protective love that terrified and thrilled her. He kissed the curves she had been taught to hate, tracing her stretch marks like they were maps to hidden treasures, constantly reinforcing that she was his equal, his partner, his queen. But Clara wasn't just a mob wife, content to sit in a mansion. She had taken the rotting carcass of Davies Logistics, purged the corrupt staff, and rebuilt it into a multi-million-dollar legitimate freight empire. It became the perfect impenetrable front for Gabriel's operations. Law enforcement couldn't find a single discrepancy in her books. She was a savant with numbers, and Gabriel's syndicate flourished under her brilliant, meticulous financial restructuring. The underworld whispered about her. They called her the heavy crown of the Marino family, but peace in their world was always temporary. Liam O'Bannon, enraged by the loss of his informants and the sudden airtight efficiency of Gabriel's empire, decided to make a desperate play. It happened at the annual Marino Charity Gala, a high society event hosted at a towering downtown hotel designed to publicly wash Gabriel's reputation. Clara was holding court in the grand ballroom, dressed in a breathtaking sapphire gown, sipping champagne, while effortlessly charming city councilmen. Gabriel stood a few feet away, his eyes constantly scanning the room, though his gaze always returned to his wife. Clara smiled politely at a judge's wife, but her sharp eyes caught a subtle inconsistency near the service doors. She managed the logistics and payroll for all Marino-owned properties. She knew exactly what the catering staff's uniforms looked like, and she knew the protocols. 3 men carrying silver trays were walking toward Gabriel. Their white shirts were too stiff, hiding the bulk of body armor beneath. But it was their footwear that confirmed her terrifying suspicion. They weren't wearing slip-resistant kitchen shoes. They were wearing heavy lace-up tactical boots. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She didn't scream. Panic would cause a stampede. Clara dropped her champagne glass. It shattered on the marble floor with a sharp crash. As Gabriel spun toward the noise, Clara locked eyes with him and signed a quick, discreet gesture. They had developed a tap to her collarbone. Threat approaching. Gabriel's survival instincts flared instantly. Before the O'Bannon assassins could raise their suppressed weapons from beneath the silver trays, Gabriel drew his weapon and fired. Chaos erupted. Screams tore through the ballroom as guests dove for cover. The assassins returned fire, shattering the grand chandeliers. Gabriel's enforcers instantly flooded the room, turning the gala into a war zone. Gabriel lunged across the floor, tackling Clara behind a massive, overturned marble table. "Are you hit?" He roared over the deafening gunfire, his hands frantically checking her for blood. "I'm fine," Clara yelled back, her mind racing. "It's O'Bannon's men. They came through the kitchen service elevators. We need to move! We're pinned down!" Gabriel shouted, firing 2 precise shots over the table. "Gabriel, listen to me." Clara grabbed his lapels, forcing him to look at her. "I audited this building's architectural blueprints last month. For the tax zoning appeal, the kitchen service elevators lead down, but there's an old laundry chute directly behind the ice machines that drops straight into the sub-basement parking garage. Your extraction vehicles are parked on level C, right?" Gabriel stared at her, awe piercing through the adrenaline of the firefight. "You memorized the blueprints?" "I memorize everything," she said, a fierce, unapologetic smile on her face. Following Clara's exact directions, Gabriel and his elite guards laid down covering fire, pushing back the assassins just enough to breach the kitchen doors. Clara led them through the labyrinth of the commercial kitchen, bypassing the compromised elevators, and locating the heavy steel door of the industrial laundry chute. They dropped down the chute landing safely in the canvas carts in the sub-basement, mere yards away from their armored convoy. By the time O'Bannon's men realized they had lost their targets, Gabriel's backup teams had arrived, wiping out the Irish Syndicate's hit squad entirely. As the armored SUV sped away from the hotel, the sirens wailing in the distance, Clara leaned back against the leather seat, her chest heaving. She looked down at her hands. They weren't trembling. Gabriel reached out his large hand, wrapping around hers. He pulled her gently into his chest, burying his face in her hair. "You saved my life," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saw what my best men missed." Clara looked up at him, the neon city lights flashing across his aristocratic face. She thought about Richard and Jonathan, currently sitting in an 8x8 concrete cell, scrub-brushing prison toilets while they served out their 30-year sentences. They had called her stupid. They had called her a pig. They had tried to throw her to the wolves, but they had forgotten one crucial detail. When you throw a brilliant, resilient woman to the wolves, she doesn't get eaten. She comes back, leading the pack. "I told you, Gabriel," Clara murmured, leaning up to kiss the man who had shown her exactly what she was worth. "I'm not a hostage anymore. I'm the queen, and in the dark, thrilling embrace of the Mafia's most feared boss, Clara Marino finally knew unequivocally that she was beautiful, she was brilliant, and she was entirely unshakable. If Clara's incredible journey from a bullied hidden daughter to a powerful, unshakable queen left you speechless, hit that like button. Familial betrayal is a deep wound, but watching karma catch up to Richard and Jonathan is the ultimate justice. What would you have done in Clara's shoes? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to share this story with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, jaw-dropping, true-to-life dramas.